Years ago, back in the 1980s, there was an Israeli song that began with the words, Kol Shana Matchila B'Siman She'ela. Every year begins with a question mark. Now, there's nothing earth-shattering about that insight. Obviously, we begin the new year with a question mark and an inherent uncertainty about the future. The very image of the book of life, written on Rosh Hashanah and sealed on Yom Kippur, affirms our preoccupation at this time with uncertainty about what the coming year will bring. The Talmud teaches, Kol hatchalot kashot, all beginnings are hard, and beginnings often fill us with uncertainty. And that is probably what the writer of this Israeli pop song had in mind in the 1980s. Speaking of uncertainty, our plan actually was for Cantor Barber to sing the song because it's a really catchy tune. I'll send it to you in a YouTube so you'll be able to enjoy it. And I want to explain to you what I'm really thinking about this morning. With uncertainty, we often have to figure out how to respond. And our president, Michelle Anfang, has encouraged me to use the word nimble. Throughout her presidency, she said, we need to be nimble, which of course she's right. But what I wanted to do this morning is I wanted to put a little bit of meat on that idea. And I wanted to think about what Jewish wisdom might offer us and how we navigate uncertainty. Nimble is the word, but I want us to be thinking about it, and I actually couldn't have planned it better had I tried. Cantor has a cold. She doesn't sound like herself at all. As of Friday, we were down a custodian. We, your temple staff, needed to be nimble, and we really needed to think about how we respond to curveballs or uncertainties. And so with that in mind, I want to share some ideas with you. The truth is, people have always lived with uncertainty, from illness and disease to snow days, plane cancellations, corporate mergers, or closings. The idea of changes and uncertainties brought about by the last 2 years have shown us, however, just how much we've taken for granted and how many of us naively relied on what we thought was the certainty in our lives. The reality of COVID, the disease, the varying responses, and far-flung impacts reminded us all that so much is unknown. A concept I suspect our ancestors, even just a few generations ago, understood intimately. After all, you know the Yiddish expression, man plans and God laughs. With the metaphoric book of life open before us and before God, we'll explore what wisdom Judaism might offer us about navigating uncertainty. A colleague of mine in London, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, has noted that the Jewish tradition we actually begin our new year with not just one question mark, but multiple. First, he notes that with just a little bit of imagination, the shofar, the instrument of Rosh Hashanah, actually looks like a question mark. And then he says, the shofar differs from almost every other musical instrument. Strike a key of the piano or pluck a string of the cello, and you know pretty well what sound is going to come out. But even for the very best shofar blower, there is at least a little bit of uncertainty. Pianos, guitars, cellos, trumpets are all made to careful technical speculations, while the shofar retains the wildness and unpredictability of its natural materials, and thus of nature and reality. It is that unpredictability and naturalness that makes the shofar quite a good metaphor for a new year that is naturally filled with unpredictability. When we look on the past, we know, as is often said, the one thing that is constant is change. Inevitably, in 5783, we'll be spending a lot of time juggling uncertainties, making decisions with insufficient information, and adjusting to altered and necessitated realities. In fact, we're already doing that now. As we sit here with the last foot barely out of 5782 and our first foot barely in 5783, we also may feel like we're standing in a doorway between worlds and even lifetimes. And while I hate to date things around the pandemic, think about how far we've come since Rosh Hashanah 2020. Changing realities, vaccines, increased immunity based on exposure and acceptance have certainly enabled us to move on from how we responded 2 years ago. Many of you are here in our Cantor Morton James Sanctuary, which was unavailable to you 2 years ago. And at the same time, because of the changes we made and the reality of COVID concerns, many of you can join us from home. Regardless of where you are, here we are, in this moment, this space of uncertainty together. And this space and time is one of both confidence tinged with humility. What do I mean? Are not these two things contradictory? So my first piece of wisdom from our tradition has to do with having confidence in decision-making and humility at the same time. Confidence in decision-making and humility are not opposites. In fact, they need to work together. In order to move into 5783, we have to work with confidence that things will happen, things we planned for, and things that we did not. Moses Maimonides teaches that a righteous person is someone who does not waffle when making a decision. The tzaddik can be trusted, amar alav lav ve'al kain kain. When that person says no, it's a real no. And when that person says yes, it's a real yes. Indeed, for Maimonides, who is thinking as a Jewish legalist making a decision, yes has to mean yes, and no has to mean no. Though he might have been thinking as a physician or as a father or as a community member or as a businessman, there are countless moments in life that necessitate definite, clear, undisputed answers. But I have to imagine that Maimonides had the humility to know that today's yes or today's no may or may not always be applicable or suitable. And Maimonides knew from uncertainty, as he lost his brother and his family's wealth in a storm at sea, which understandably drove the Rambam into a deep depression and acceptance of uncertainty. I said that I wanted to see how Jewish wisdom might help us manage uncertainty, and my first point was that decision-making and humility are not mutually exclusive, and as a result, we have to accept others' decisions, even if we might make a different decision. For example, some of us are not ready to be inside with hundreds of unmasked people. Some of us are fine to be inside with hundreds of unmasked people. Some of us wear a mask when we go into the big Y, others do not. And while I illustrate my point using COVID, the issue extends far beyond. Some of us are afraid to fly and would only take a driving vacation, not because of COVID, but because they're afraid of airplanes. Some of us, when there's a threat of a snowstorm, we stay home. As we make decisions, I urge us to remember we make decisions for ourselves, and we allow space for others to make decisions for themselves, not judging them, not disparaging them, but recognizing they have their issues that they're managing, and we have ours. That's my first point. My second point of how we manage uncertainty in making decisions actually comes from Pirkei Avot. Hillel the Elder presented two apparently contradictory teachings, one right after the other. Imein ani li mili, uchsha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I'm not for myself, who will be? And if I'm only for myself, what am I? In other words, when making a decision, we should prioritize our own needs. But our tradition teaches we should not only prioritize our own needs. Indeed, Pirkei Avot is teaching that when prioritizing self over community, there must be space to consider what kind of self you are in that moment. The teaching continues, if not now, when? We have to make decisions. We can't vacillate and debate and wonder and examine for forever. At some point, we need to decide. So I've spoken about humility and decision-making and about the needs to negotiate the individual and the community. The final example of how Jewish tradition guides us during times of uncertainty comes from the story of the Israelites wandering in the desert. I find it helpful to note that our ancestors' feelings about uncertainty made up a good percentage of the contents of the Torah. 4/5 of the Torah take place in a span of just 40 years. While the book of Genesis covers from creation to our arrival in Egypt, the remaining 4 books cover our exodus from Egypt to our arrival into the shores of the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land. And while those 4 books cover the 40 years of wandering in the desert, nearly 39 of those 40 years are not mentioned at all. That's right, 4 books for roughly 18 months of recorded life. And when you take out the commandments, of which nearly all 613 are there, most of the remaining chapters describe the people of Israel in their typical mode: complaint, disagreement, dispute, disappointment. Complaint, disagreement, dispute, disappointment. I could go on with that. While we usually explain away the Israelites complaining to their general immaturity and obnoxiousness, there is an approach which is to see the Israelites complaining as a symptom of their anxiety at being in a time of transition, a symptom of their anxiety at dealing with uncertainty. They've left behind the oppression of slavery, which, while obviously unpleasant, was at least predictable. Suddenly, they're thrust into the freedom of the desert. You would think they'd be overjoyed, and yet they do sing songs of victory, but very quickly they revert to complaining. And on several occasions, I'll remind you, they actually speak wistfully of the good old days in Egypt. On a few occasions, they even turn around and want to head back. Perhaps the simplest explanation for our ancestors' behavior is that they craved certainty and stability, just as often we do. They complained when they didn't have that stability. Our ancestors knew they were leaving a time of stability, and eventually a new time would emerge. But the current form, the journey, the transition, that was really uncomfortable. And so what could they do but complain? The reality is, transitions are difficult, even in the best of circumstances. Anthropologists use a particular term to refer to moments of transition. They call these liminal moments, following the Latin word for doorway. These are times in our lives when we find ourselves walking through a doorway without a clear sense of what will greet us on the other side. Such liminal moments hold promise and excitement for new possibilities, but necessarily and actually inherently, they are times of uncertainty. They are times when we leave behind that which we knew. And for many of us, that makes us anxious. Probably everyone in this sanctuary has been in a liminal moment. When a spouse dies and we are forced to recreate our lives. When we become an empty nester and we are challenged to create new routines. When young adults graduate college, there's a huge transition as these young adults need to create routines and establish a new kind of living. When we move from one home to another, from one state to another. When we change jobs, when we get divorced. When someone retires, they are leaving one reality and are challenged to find new structures, new routines, new ways of living. To live life is to have known liminal moments. The Jewish life cycles mark those moments as well. The liminal moments are difficult, but they can actually be times for maximal creativity and growth. Certainly that's true of the 40 years of wandering in the desert, which was a time when our ancestors became forged as a people. And so often our most valuable achievements, our most valuable insights take place at these critical junctures of uncertainty. And I want to pause and think about our community for a moment and think about the uncertainty we have navigated. Anthropologists talk about creativity and growth. I believe that's what we've experienced as a congregation in the last few years. I know we've struggled, and I know it's been hard, but we've also grown. And I want to get very specific to this last weekend when we found ourselves without a custodian on Friday at 3 o'clock. And Sunday morning at 8 o'clock, there were lots of volunteers here to ensure that our building was ready and that we would be ready. Creativity and growth. There was probably some anxiety. I didn't see too much obnoxiousness, but who knows, maybe there was. It's hard. Our challenge when we are faced with moments of uncertainty, when there is a question mark, our challenge is to bring our best selves forward and to be humble and yet to make a decision, to think about ourselves and yet to think about the community, and to understand that in this moment of uncertainty, in this liminal moment of transition, there is an opportunity for growth if we open our heart, if we keep our ears open to the possibility, if we allow ourselves to grow, then perhaps we will. With the setting sun last night, 5782 closed. With the setting sun last night, 5783 open. With the creation, God created evening first according to the rabbis. When one day ends, there is darkness and uncertainty, but as the day unfolds and develops, light grows in the morning. There is darkness and uncertainty, but there will be light and definition. Our year begins with a question mark, and even an instrument shaped like one, as every year does. As we pray for the best possible outcomes for our family and friends and community, in our nation and our world, we also note that we're standing in a doorway from year to year, from one way of being in the world to another that is unknown. We ask God and each other to be patient with us, to recognize and soothe our discomfort, to guide us to make wise decisions, even without all the information we would like, and to help us fully appreciate this transitional moment and approach it with creativity that the moment demands and deserves. And the song says, Kol shana matchila besiman she'elah. Every year begins with a question mark. And the chorus is, Va'anachnu nimsa lo tshuva. And we will find in this year an answer. Shana Tova.